All right. Good evening, everyone. So, thank you for joining the Friends of San Pedro Valley Park on this cold and wet evening. I'm Mila Stroganoff, your programs director and field trips director for the Friends, and also your host tonight. We have an excellent program this evening, and I'm thrilled that Morgan Stickrod is joining us tonight, and that so many of you have decided to join us. We have been most fortunate that Morgan has presented twice before, the first time on the flora and fauna of the Farallon Islands, and the second time on the native trees of California, a major undertaking, I must say, and well done. Before I introduce Morgan, allow me to give you a heads up regarding our upcoming program, The Return of the Beaver, in February. The date is Saturday, February the 3rd at 7 p.m. In her program, Heidi Perriman will discuss the return of beavers, the Castor canadensis, to our landscape, what it means to our creeks and infrastructure, biodiversity, and resilience to climate change. We must not forget that the beaver was decimated in North America by the end of the 1800s by Europeans. It was hunted near extinction in Europe by the 1400s. Even if it is possible to have this fascinating animal return to its native habitat, is it beneficial to coexist with an animal that can chew down the landscaping? We can use tax dollars to plants. Is there any value to sharing our streams with a creature that can block culverts and flood roads? So tune in on February the 3rd and let's find out. Moving on. A little extra here. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the lecture. Morgan will be with us and he'll answer some of these questions and comments. And this session will be recorded. And so I'm happy to say we will have it posted to our website. We have a new IT person who will be assisting the Friends of San Pedro Valley Park with our website. If you wish to listen and view, just go to our website, friendsofsanpedrovalleypark.org. If you want to tell your friends about it, by all means do so. Consider becoming a member and supporting the programming. And now I'm very pleased to go on and introduce our speaker tonight. Morgan Stickrod is currently the senior botanist at Soul Ecology. He's a botanist and plant ecologist with over 10 years of experience doing research, fieldwork throughout California and southeastern United States, Mexico, and South America. He completed his Master's of Science at San Francisco State University, where his research focused on floristics, dispersal dynamics, and rare plant management within the Suisun Marsh estuarine complex. Recently, he has also been involved in research projects studying groups such as manzanitas, the Arctostaphylos species, mariposa lilies, Calochortus species, California's floristic province endemic thistles, the Cirsium species, and Chaparral P. picaringia montana. In recent years, he's also worked for the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission doing rare plant management work throughout the San Francisco Peninsula watershed and Santa Cruz Mountains. He's also done consulting and floristic work throughout much of California, including vegetation mapping of Southeast Farallon Island, floristics of San Pedro Valley, and numerous rare plant mapping projects in areas such as the Klamath Mountain region, the Sierra Nevada, and the Mojave Desert. So, Morgan, take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Mila, and yeah, thanks for having me, Friends of San Pedro Valley Park, yet again. And
Morgan, excuse me, can you speak a little louder, or shall we increase the volume?
Up to you. This is how's it sound now?
You're pretty quiet.
Huh. Okay.
So let's see. Where's the volume? It wouldn't be here. I have to turn this all off in order to get. Do you think you could speak a little louder?
Let's
Because I'd have to go off and come back in.
gotcha. I mean, if
That's better.
okay, cool.
That's
Yeah, I
better.
can do that.
Thanks.
Yeah, if it's too quiet at any point, just let me know and I can take care of that. But anyway, to get started, I guess Mila gave a bit of a background here, and my talk tonight is on basically the plant diversity and plant communities of San Pedro Valley Park. And I guess a little bit of context, as Mila mentioned, I've been working as a botanist throughout California for a while, but in particular, I worked just down the peninsula from San Pedro Valley Park for the SFPUC on the Peninsula watershed, doing a lot of our plant work in areas that also encompass Montara Mountain, a lot of which is shared by, or part of which is encompassed within San Pedro Valley Park. And I just have a very strong affinity for the park. I also was hired to put together a plant list for the park, which is on the website, based on personal inventory, some of Tony Corelli's collection work, older barium specimens, and so on. But it's also it's a work in progress. But always, I love the fact that the park, you think about it or you hear about it, and you think of it as maybe just a small city park, but instead it's a great example of some of the most intact maritime chaparral throughout the Santa Cruz Mountains, and just a really kind of fascinating assemblage of plants in really close proximity to an urban interface and encompassing a very cool and interesting part of the Santa Cruz Mountains. So tonight, it's my approach here. I'm not going to talk about each individual species. That would take too long and be kind of a boring narrative. So my thought was to give a little bit of background, a little bit of broader context, geologically, culturally, biogeographically, and really focus on the prominent habitats or ecosystems found within the park, where we'll discuss some of the processes that define those habitats and some of the more prominent or dominant or just kind of interesting species that are found within there. And at the end, I'll cover just a hint, since we're deep in winter now, there's a good rain. So we're very close to the onset of early blooming wildflower season. So I wanted to include a few interesting plants and some early emergence that people are out there that you might be able to see. So get started. So background context, the park itself is around 1,052 acres. It's technically within the northern spur of the Santa Cruz Mountains. Not sure if you can see my cursor here, but it's this little segment that also encompasses San Bruno Mountain, just outside of Colma, Daly City. And so it is technically part of the Santa Cruz Mountains, but it's sort of this northern disconnect. And the park itself encompasses a segment of Montara Mountain, as well as San Pedro Mountain, and also has the headwaters of San Pedro Creek. It's a really interesting geologic story as far as where the park and the mountain is positioned. So Montara Mountain, it was part of the Selenian complex, which it's associated with predominantly granitic rocks, and it's positioned on the park itself, in Montara Mountain is on the Pacific plate. So if you look at this first figure here, you can see this line cutting through for the San Andreas Fault. To the right, we have the North American plate, but to the left is the Pacific plate, and we see Montara Mountain and San Pedro Valley, the valley being cut by the Pilarcitos Fault. But basically, the Selenian complex it's a term that encompasses it's basically an uplift that occurred around 110 to 80 million years ago. A lot of it was thought to be caused by the Farallon plate, being gradually subducted underneath the North American plate. And it produced large outcrops or large intrusions of granite. So Montara Mountain is interesting because there's not much granite throughout the Bay Area in general, or even a lot of the coastal ranges, but the upper elevations of Montara Mountain are granites and very similar in texture, quality, and character, vegetation character that you would find in higher elevations of the Sierra Nevada, or if you look west to the Farallon Islands. And the reason for that is because they all originated like the Sierra Nevada, Farallons, and so on in the same orogenic event. So it's thought that this sort of the granites associated with Montara Mountain potentially slot off of the southern Sierra Nevada and gradually move north along the San Andreas, with the Pacific Plate, along the strike slip San Andreas Fault. And we'll get into a bit more of that as far as soils, but a bit about the more, I guess, the cultural history of San Pedro Valley. Most importantly, the valley itself has been inhabited for a very long time, millennia. Ramaytush Ohlone were the indigenous inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula, and in particular, the Aramai, and I apologize, I'm not sure on the appropriate, or I guess the right pronunciation. I'll do my best. Aramai were the tribelet that inhabited the western portion of the peninsula. Puristak was basically the village, more or less permanent village that was set up in San Pedro Valley. It's currently, that area is the current site of the Sanchez Adobe and Pacifica, which is sort of a relic of San Pedro Valley becoming a mission outpost when Spanish arrived in the late 18th century. And in more recent times, there were 2 trout farms throughout the 50s and 60s before the park was established that were obliterated in a flood. But I want to emphasize in particular a lot of, thinking about the Ohlonian habitation within San Pedro Valley and the mountains, because their activity was, had very much, there were a lot of sort of ecosystem engineering, and a lot of legacies of that persist to this day, that correspond not just with natural processes, our environment, but also, for instance, cultural burning, different sort of riparian infrastructure, and different ways that they engage with the landscape that we see definitely altered, but sort of relics of continuing to this day. But thinking about the flora itself of San Pedro Valley Park, here's kind of a demographic breakdown. And keep in mind, this is very preliminary. As mentioned, this hasn't been not an academic or thorough floristic study. Let's see, just checking. Sorry, making sure the volume is still okay. Okay. So in a broad context, we have, as far as ferns and fern allies go, there are 7 families, 10 genera, and 13 species within the park. For trees, 13 families, 17 genera, and 19 species. Shrubs, quite a few. 18 families, 30 genera, and 35 species. 5 families, 5 genera, and 9 species of vines. And as far as forbs or herbaceous species, both annuals, perennials, geophytes, for dicots, there are about 36 families, 122 genera, and 174 species. And for monocots, includes sort of the liliaceous monocots, the lilies, iris, trillium, different other groups like that, and also grasses, sedges, rushes. We have 12 families, 40 genera, and 49 species. And floristically, it's an interesting area. There's sort of this kind of a botanical joke of just anywhere in California, you're in a transition area. And there's some truth to that, but the position of San Pedro Valley Park is interesting because you do have, on one hand, this very strong affinity for the rest of the Santa Cruz Mountains flora, which has its own very unique characters, but also taxonomically represents the southern extent of many northern taxa, species that are a lot more abundant in the Pacific Northwest, Northern California, that region, that climatically, ecologically are, at least in our current conditions, current era, basically reach their southern limit or southern tolerance threshold in the Santa Cruz Mountains. But it also, as mentioned, it's in close proximity to San Bruno Mountain. And so they're, well, perhaps not as prominent as the habitat found along the ridgeline of San Bruno Mountain. There are aspects and overlap of this sort of relictual Franciscan flora that can be found within the park. Franciscan flora was thought to be, when it was around prior to the development of San Francisco and so on, sort of the small, I forget, James Aroof called it the smallest floristic affinity or smallest, within the California floristic province, but it had a very unique, very distinct floristic character to it. And so anyway, you do find that within the park to some degree, especially in the maritime chaparral. It's particularly in species that overlap with San Bruno Mountains, such as the Montara manzanita and the San Francisco wallflower. And to note, the predominant soils throughout San Bruno Valley Park are these Barnaby and Candlestick soil series, predominantly sandstone, a little bit of shale, but part of the Franciscan complex, and that is shared with San Bruno Mountain. But there's also, again, this sort of, while Montara Mountain is granites aren't, if you think about edaphic conditions or soil being a strong selective context for speciation, granite is not one that tends to stand out as being particularly stressful or driving endemism, but it does create localized conditions that limit or create, or I guess that greatly influence the communities or assemblage of species that can occur there. So that's, that's also important in considering the floristics of the park. And also just this, again, granite and this Miramar soil series, decomposed granite that excludes a lot of non-native species, and you get a really interesting sort of interface of coastal maritime chaparral and sort of the Sierran granites. Again, just really at the higher elevations of the park as you get up to onto the ridge towards Montara Mountain. And so there are 5 major habitat types within the park, and that's sort of how I'm gonna run through the talk today. And maritime chaparral is a big one. There's riparian, there is eucalyptus forest, and also degrees of grassland and coastal scrub. So yeah, as mentioned, just going to kind of walk us through this, talk about those, and I think as far as questions go, as Mila said, can get to them at the end. If anything is very confusing or volume issues come up, Mila, please feel free to interject and let me know. Okay, so starting with maritime chaparral. Chaparral, if anyone who is from California or has lived here for any amount of time are likely familiar with, at least with the term and definitely the site of chaparral. Chaparral describes shrub dominant communities. There are rarely many trees in the interior kind of drier areas. You might get gray pine, you might get some degree of cypress that can tolerate usually harsh soils and really dry, xeric, stressful conditions. But by and large, these are shrub dominant environments. A number of different types of chaparral, but again, it's unified by this shrub dominant character. And the reason for that are due to a few different factors. One is that chaparral tends to occur on shallow, nutrient poor soils, often rocky, and that limits the growth potential of plants, nutrient availability. It can exclude certain plants that require higher uptake of, or maybe localized hydrology or nutrient input. Or it could be challenging soils like ultramafic soils like serpentine, very, you know, very coarse, I guess, shales or volcanics. But then also fire is huge for chaparral. These are typically communities that have evolved under various degrees of fire regimes, and they become sort of this defining factor. Even so, most shrubs that inhabit chaparral, whether coastal or interior, have evolved some degree of adaptations for tolerating fire, whether it be so with manzanitas, they were kind of I guess the rock stars of chaparral, so to speak. You have two life history strategies where you have obligate cedars, which are those that a fire comes through, let's say once every 15 to 40 years. It will usually be high intensity. These are dense shrub or shrubby habitats, and it'll be a canopy fire, basically clearing the full stand, most standing vegetation. Obligate cedars, the entire above ground plant is burned, but seeds dispersed by caching rodents and dormant in the soil, they form a persistent seed bank that are activated by conditions following a fire and the onset of winter rains. And you also have resprouters. So not just manzanitas, but many plants will form basal burrows, which are basically these areas of meristematic tissue at the base of the plant. A fire comes through and burns the top of the plant. Basically, then it just sort of activates or triggers new growth to initiate immediately from the areas of meristematic tissue. And it's not always at the base of the plant. Many of our oaks, there's a lot of meristematic tissue along the branches and other portions of the stem, redwoods, and so on. So these different strategies are there in place because of this long history with, especially with the onset of the Mediterranean climate, 7.5 million years ago and into the present, that sort of selectively favored plants that have different types of response mechanisms for dealing with regular disturbance. But for maritime chaparral, these are really defined geographically and positionally by being coastal, very close to the coast and at low elevations. But critically for maritime chaparral is this idea of summer water availability. We'll get into that a little more in a minute here, but the summer water availability leads to very high diversity relative to other chaparral systems. And what that means also is that you get, for instance, in this top right photo here, it's really cool. If you get up, into Montara Mountain or some of the, higher elevation chaparral on I guess the Hazelnut Trail within San Pedro Valley or the Montara Mountain Trail, you see just manzanitas, Chrysolepis chrysophylla, all these kind of shrubs just covered in this diverse assemblage of lichen, bryophytes, and so on, which is pretty cool to see and not something you're used to seeing in otherwise dry, xeric, harsh chaparral. So this figure it's from a paper that Mike Vasey and several others published in 2014 that I think is really cool and sort of takes home why maritime chaparral is unique within the greater framework of chaparral, but in particular when considering the maritime chaparral of the park. So just in case the figure isn't self-explanatory, I kind of, or is a little confusing. It's in summary on left, basically, if we work down here, I just want to run through this real quick. So these top two boxes right here, box A on the left is looking at elevation and B is distance from the coast. And what we see, how they're labeled. So each of the boxes, the one on the far left is for maritime chaparral. The middle one is transition, which is sort of it's close to the coast, but it's higher elevation and slightly interior. So maybe influenced by the maritime layer and fog, but to a lesser degree than maritime chaparral on the coast. And interior chaparral is sort of more the dry foothill chaparral that you would think of, let's say the Sierra Nevada foothills, east of the immediate coast ranges. So yeah, the take homes, maritime chaparral relative to the other two, they are distinctly relatively low elevation, and they do occur in very close proximity to the coast. So C, this is the mean daily dry season atmospheric water potential. So one thing with the California floristic province and being our Mediterranean type climate, we have the summer drought season, which, that's very selective. But it's a major stress that plants have to deal with, especially if you're an annual. You can flower during the winter rainy season, hopefully go to seed and disperse, get the seed sorted before the drought season kicks in. If you're a woody plant, you have to have physiological or some other mechanisms to deal with 5 to 6 months of no rain and often very high temperatures, no soil water, and temperatures that are driving respiration, evapotranspiration. So it's an extremely stressful context for woody plants. So what C is looking at is during the summer, the dry season, what is the water potential that occurs within these different chaparral types? And what we see is that maritime chaparral has a significantly higher relative water potential during the summer season. But then D is also the percent of time that cloud cover is present at mid-morning during the dry season. So that speaks to, again, this cloud cover versus open, full exposure to sun, high temperatures. Cloud cover would minimize loss to, evapotranspiration, respiration, and it really buffers any stress and water loss, just mitigating temperature in particular. And then on the bottom here, looking at temperature, we have the average daily temperatures between June and August, the driest, hottest time of the year for much of California. And that's averaged over 30 years. And we see the maritime chaparral being, again, significantly lower than both the transition and interior chaparral. And then the last one this is kind of interesting, but looking at rainfall, with just annual rainfall, maritime chaparral, while having sort of this, what appears to be really pronounced sort of, not hydrologic, but I guess available water context relative to other chaparral, it actually has the lowest annual rainfall relative to both interior and transition chaparral. So it's again kind of this trade-off, but so it may not receive or be able to accumulate the greatest amount of sort of wintertime precipitation via rain, but it has it's basically able to buffer and have access and availability to water throughout the year, which is critical, and most systems don't in California. So it's also defined by, in the same study that they did, which I didn't include here, of chaparral types, maritime chaparral, it's known for having basically the highest diversity of chaparral systems. And again, this has to do with water availability, maritime influence, and structure. I showed the epiphytes on those. There's a lot of structural heterogeneity within this type of chaparral. And so some within the maritime chaparral of San Pedro Valley Park, some notable species, we have the Montara manzanita, which is a near endemic to the park in Montara Mountain, but just basically a handful of plants also found on San Bruno Mountain. But we have another manzanita, the brittle leaf manzanita, and then Arctophoros crustacea. We also have Eriophyllum confertiflorum, the golden yarrow, Berberis pinnata, Chrysolepis chrysophylla, and also notable is the Franciscan wallflower, Erisum franciscanum. And so these are just a handful. I just wanted to cover here, but within the park, some great areas to really get into the maritime chaparral are along the Hazelnut Trail. And then again, if you continue to the Montara Mountain Trail, and if you do, I recommend following it all the way to the summit. So the opposite of maritime chaparral can be found, unfortunately, in relatively great abundance, but it's eucalyptus forest. And yeah, within the park, these consist entirely of Eucalyptus globulus, the blue gum eucalyptus, and the myrtaceae. These are native to southwestern Australia, which also is experiences one of the 5 Mediterranean climate regions of the world, which is one of the reasons why it does so well here and why people readily planted it throughout California and formed these sort of, biological fences, biological walls, these sort of dense groves and plantations, but they do occur still, or they are still standing throughout much of the park as these dense groves and plantations. And floristically, these, sure, yes, it is non-native, but is also floristically depauperate, just meaning there's not much diversity that can be found within these types of forests. And that's due largely, these stands form these dense canopies, letting very little light down to the floor. They also form a very deep litter layer. Eucalyptus are, they're beautiful plants, and the sort of exfoliating or peeling bark is, it's gorgeous, but it also it accumulates on the floor of the forest and forms these very thick layers of of litter accumulation, which would block many plants or herbaceous species that might be germinating. That's going to also compound inhibiting light availability. And there's also the production of cineol or eucalyptol, which is are the properties that primarily are found in eucalyptus oil that, maybe they, despite the reputation of, or sort of the anecdotal nature of people thinking of eucalyptus as allelopathic, might get overemphasized, but as far as the oils themselves go, it nonetheless contributes. It is an astringent that might compound these other factors that minimize the establishment of other plants within these eucalyptus forests. As mentioned, there are many groves in San Pedro Valley Park. As you can see here, just some kind of landscape shots of how they turn out. And, they sort of, there's sort of this matrix, or they integrate with these intact systems. In the bottom left there, you can see eucalyptus forest abuts almost a dense stand of Montara manzanita, kind of right in this, and also it's winter, but a lot of the senescent shrubs right there are Corylus cornuta, a hazelnut. And so in the midst of these sort of coastal scrub or maritime chaparral areas, you'll get these stands of eucalyptus, and it's a management concern. And but nonetheless, I guess for some positives, they do provide, they are excellent habitat for a number of birds, a number of insects, butterflies. I don't know if monarchs are known for utilizing these stands, but they do use others. Eucalyptus stands to the north and south down the coastline. It's not all bad. And despite the fact that they can recruit, they're arguably not as aggressive as many other invasives, definitely not as much as Genista, French broom, and other problematic species. So they are nonetheless a part of the park to consider. So riparian, as mentioned, we have, so the headwaters of San Pedro Creek run through the park. And you have a number of different streams that course through different areas of the park. But when we refer to riparian in terms of vegetation, it's really describing this interface between the terrestrial and riverine as a course concept, just sort of whether it's a river, a creek, or a stream. But it's sort of this interface between the two systems. And it's defined by having this perennial water availability, generally also the movement of water. And this can be, as a trickle or kind of a pulse between winter flooding and sort of a summer, a much lower kinetic or lower energy late season flow. But because of the fact that it deals with periodic flooding, plants that occur in association with riparian areas have to evolve some degree of physiological or physical structural tolerance for flooding, prolonged inundation, soil saturation, and so on. But these, when you think about it too, thinking about the Mediterranean climate and the throughout California, water is a critically limiting factor, or a resource for plants. And so anywhere where there's fresh water available throughout the year has a there's high competitive demand to be able to get there. So what that ends up resulting in are these in riparian areas are this dense canopy of woody trees and shrubs within the park and through a lot of the Santa Cruz Mountains and into sort of Marin County, the coastal mountains up there. These are usually dominated by a suite of red alder, Ulmus rubra. In San Pedro Park, there's some great stands of creek dogwood, Cornus sericea, and then on the margins, sort of whether as lower shrubs or arborescent shrubs, stature of trees, essentially, you have quite a bit of arroyo willow, Salix laciolepis, as well as some intergrades with other species of Salix that occur in the area, Salix sitchensis in particular. And you also get, patchy bits of red elderberry, Sambucus racemosa, many ferns in the understory. That's mostly what can tolerate the low light conditions of it, as well as occasionally some trillium or other shade tolerant herbaceous species, whether perennials or just ephemeral understory bloomers. But fortunately, also quite a bit of non-native invasive species, such as it's really bad and evident this time of year is Cape ivy, Delaria odorata, and later in the season, Convolvulus arvensis, another kind of vining advantageous weedy species. But yeah, you also have Brooks Creek, and as mentioned, the middle and south forks of San Pedro Creek are what is really encompassed by riparian habitat within the park. But these, beyond the plants, these are very important in as far as habitat for wildlife species. There's structural complexity to riparian systems, and just again, having this perennial water source is critical for so many different tiers and groups of wildlife, mammals, various rodents, cats, dogs, birds, insects, and so on. Many build their nests there. Many just visit daily, either for hunting or feeding. But there's a lot of structural complexity and structural heterogeneity that lends these to be really important areas to consider as far as habitat goes. And with that too, this critically with riparian species or riparian corridors, is that this dense canopy formed by all the trees and shrubs that are really packing in there, competing to get access to this water, that in turn regulates the water temperature, which is really important for very cool kind of local story is pertaining to the park. But San Pedro Creek is it's basically one of a handful of creek drainages where the Central Coast steelhead trout is able to still spawn. The Central Coast steelhead is considered federally threatened. Its range is from the Russian River in Sonoma County down to Soquel Creek in Santa Cruz County. Its life history, it spends the majority of its life in the Pacific Ocean, but then it comes in basically to spawn in San Pedro Creek in December to March when ideally, if we're getting more rain like this, water levels will increase and they're able to get past impediments, be able to lay eggs. But unlike a lot of salmonids, they don't actually die after their eggs and are able to return to the Pacific. But the young spend about 1 to 2 years in the creek, and then afterwards they migrate to the Pacific Ocean during the winter rainy season. And what's great is, I talked about in the beginning how just some of the land use history of the area, it was considered, a salmon farm, trout farm for several decades, and there was a lot of manipulation to the creek to form ponds and whatnot, but that impeded sort of the migratory movement and sort of spawning trout to get up into the creek. So the removal of a lot of that and restoration along the creek has led to increased numbers of the steelhead trout being able to basically, yeah, to inhabit the creek and to sort of proliferate, which is really critical considering the limited amount of habitat that is left for them to do that. Oh, and I just wanted to note too, on the left here is not a rare plant species, but it's one that I think is interesting. It's Euonymus occidentalis, the western burning bush, and it occurs, there are a handful of plants kind of right near, it's along San Pedro Creek, right where the Hazelnut Trail, what would that be? The eastern end of the Hazelnut Trail drops you into the valley. It's western burning bush, and this is a plant that's far more abundant in the Pacific Northwest, but it's a species that, like so many others too, it basically reaches its southern extent in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and it's really patchy, and you really don't encounter it very much in the Bay Area. Superficially, the leaves, the venation, it can resemble its opposite leaved. It looks as if the veins coming off the midrib of the leaf run sort of parallel in the same way that dogwood do, but they're in a mixed, very subtle, kind of very cool little flowers here. But it's an interesting species that I think gets overlooked. And San Pedro Valley Park is one of the few places. It's the only place I know of on the peninsula where the species occurs. And yeah, it's pretty cool. All right. So grasslands. These, like many throughout the state, were formerly far more prominent than they are now. Within the park, when we think of grasslands, it's really more in reference to the specific type, which is coastal prairie. And in this particular sort of coastal prairie I guess thinking of it in terms of the fact, like climatic, its position to maritime influence really dictates a lot of the floristic assembly and composition, but also just the species that it's high biodiversity, but the species that are assembled within sort of this coastal prairie assemblage, community assemblage or matrix, especially the graminoids, the grasses, sedges, and whatnot. They hold their evolutionary origins in the sort of northern Palouse prairie, which geographically is associated with southeastern Washington, north central Idaho. But these are more, again, just sort of these northern associated species: Calamagrostis nookensis, Xanthonia californica, Deschampsia cespitosa, and various a number of carex species, sedges, that occur in the more mesic grasslands immediately adjacent to the coast or on coastal terrace with hydrology and whatnot. But it's an interesting sort of where you find it intact, where it still receives enough of sort of mesic or wet influence due to the maritime influence there. It still retains this sort of relictual northern feeling and northern association. But floristically also, the coastal prairie in the Santa Cruz Mountains in particular, you also have species that are more associated with sort of affinities to the south, a lot of the tarweeds like Hemizonia and Mattia, but also just lupin, lupinus, linanthus. And so you have this kind of very cool mix that proliferates in this grassland habitat. And these are some of the coastal prairie grasslands contain some of the highest diversity of California ecosystems. And this is due, it's this matrix of annuals, perennial geophytes or bulbs, and also perennial grasses that sort of all intermix just in very tight quarters. And these were maintained for millennia. In cultural burning, the Ohlone were known to burn a lot of, in particular, a lot of coastal, along coastal margins, coastal headlands, but even within San Pedro Valley, the grasslands going up on the hill, for many reasons, they did it for food, also to attract game who were drawn to the kind of lush, new, verdant vegetation coming up from germinants. But also this contributes to this habitat structure and high diversity in this mosaic of annuals and geophytes. Also, you would occasionally find bits that they left this mosaic of also just intact other shrubs like hazelnut, occasionally manzanita, depending what sort of habitat the grasslands butted up against. But I also did this to keep, there is, in the absence of burning, you have plants like coyote brush, Baccharis palularis, which can be a very highly competitive species that will encroach readily on grassland habitat if there's a lack of disturbance, such as burning, herbivory, or something else to keep it in place. However, it's declined dramatically, especially over the past century, largely due to active fire suppression. As mentioned, encroachment. Coyote brush is sort of the classic species that gets noted just because it's able to really get established and really kind of proliferate in coastal prairie readily. But it can happen very quickly. And depending on, as mentioned, these grasslands on the coast, they're often sort of positioned in close proximity to other habitat types like coastal scrub, chaparral, or occasionally mixed coastal conifer forest. And over time, especially as you get sort of this serial or succession going on in the absence of fire or major disturbance, getting sort of this sequence of coyote brush into larger, kind of arboreal species that can create a very quick, or geologically speaking, relatively quick, completely turnover of the ecosystem and transform it from grassland into these other sort of later serial environments. And coastal prairie within California is considered very threatened, largely due to urban and agricultural development. They're positioned along the coast. This is sort of highly valued real estate area. These are areas where people try to develop, try to live, build roads, recreation areas. And so very little of it relative to the historic context is left. And they have, the diversity that they house, it's not all generalist species. There are many local endemics, many plants that were likely a lot more widespread previously, but due to development and conversion from grassland have become isolated, undergo genetic bottlenecks in certain cases, in various other degrees that have increased rarity. So as a habitat and as a system, they are considered threatened, and they contain many other special status or threatened species. So it's a really important habitat to consider in terms of thinking about management protocol over time. And what there isn't a whole lot of coastal grassland sort of left within San Pedro Valley Park, but where you can see it is along the Hazelnut Trail. If you start near the visitor center and cut up, just beyond the very large coastal live oak, you get into some areas where in about 2 months from now, we'll just be blanketed in early spring wildflowers, tons of Fritillaria affinis, Iris douglassiana, Sinicula, and other carrots. And yeah, it's gorgeous. And it's sort of in these open areas that have started being managed in regard to also sort of keeping a lot of the coyote brush or even the hazelnut and other more competitively, competitively advantageous sort of shrubby encroaching species. So coastal scrub it's a sort of a hard, or more of like it lumps in a number of different things and can't really be defined fine scale as far as like a very specific assemblage of species. But it is a shrub dominant habitat. And so we already discussed one of those, which is chaparral, maritime chaparral. So what really differentiates coastal scrub from chaparral? One thing is that coastal scrub is thought to not be, as a system, fire adapted. It's Some people consider coastal scrub as sort of something that, again, in the absence of fire or other sort of stand clearing disturbance, is perhaps the next sort of stage of succession in coastal grassland or interior grassland habitat, slightly interior. But nonetheless, there's also some overlapping composition between other, surrounding chaparral and coastal scrub. It's this coastal proximity is what sort of drives the character assemblage or the species assemblage of what you'll find there. But there nonetheless is a lot of structural heterogeneity found within there. As mentioned, it's sort of interspersed with either coastal prairie, grasslands, or patches of woodland, oak woodland, or say in certain cases, Douglas fir, mixed conifer forest, that sort of thing. So there is structural heterogeneity, and so it's excellent wildlife habitat. And within the, or I guess some of the dominant species that you tend to associate with coastal scrub would be, again, coyote brush, Bacchus palularis. Other dominants as far as native plants go would be California sagebrush, Artemisia californica, everyone's favorite poison oak, Toxicodendron diversilobum. A gorgeous one that is just starting to bloom right now is the blood currant, Ribes sanguineum, variety glutinosum, and also sometimes, though usually in chaparral, Ribes malvaceum, which and then you'll find patches of coffeeberry, Frangula californica, occasionally toyon, Heteromeles arbitifolia, and California blackberry. And again, some of these can also occur in maritime chaparral, so it's it's a lot more fluid than these sort of very strict or sharp delineations between habitat. But another thing with coastal scrub is, especially in a context like this of the park, where there is kind of this long and sort of complex land use history, coastal scrub is often where many non-native plants are able to get established and proliferate. Along the Valley View Trail, which in the park is probably the best trail to hike in order to get a sense of coastal scrub. One plant that's really taken off in recent years is the late Cotoneaster coriaceus. There's quite a bit of pampas grass, Cordaria jubata, unfortunately also within some of the creek drainages as well. And that's an issue. But you'll find lots of non-native grasses too, tons of rattlesnake grass, Brisa maxima, the various avenas and bromus, non-native bromus grasses, and then quite a bit of French broom, Genista montspeciolana. Something that sort of straddles the coastal scrub, maritime chaparral interface or gradient, if you will, is this really interesting assemblage that's almost unique to San Pedro Valley Park, which is sort of this hazelnut scrub shrubland alliance. And so what this is referring to is Corylus cornuta, the beaked hazelnut, but in particular, subspecies californica, California hazelnut, differentiated, a few subtle ways, but also just it tends to be found in more shrub dominant open habitats, whereas in much of the northern extent of the species range, you'll find in sort of more mesic or shaded forest understory. But these, as per the namesake of the trail, the Hazelnut Trail, these are quite predominant throughout the park. And it's one of the few cases where you'll really see it in such abundance. But as a species, they are monoecious, so both sort of the staminate and pistillate, the male and female flowers, are produced on the same plant, except they're separate. So each individual flower is unisexual, and the inflorescences are called catkins. So you can see the photos on the left, you have the staminate or male catkins, and on the bottom, the pistillate, female catkins. And, for those, I guess, definition of that, or a way to think of it, is just it's a elongate cluster of single sex flowers that they bear sort of these very small scaly bracts, but they tend to lack petals. And the reason for that is that they're wind pollinated flowers. These don't rely on insect pollination or any other sort of zootic or animal based pollen dispersal. And so they're in these very exposed areas, as you can see in the top right photo. And wind is a very effective dispersal mechanism for the pollen, pollinates the pistillate catkin, and then in the bottom right will mature into a hazelnut, which was also a very important, important food source for the Ohlone. And it's quite abundant throughout the valley, as you can see, and in the hills. But yeah, this idea of this hazelnut scrub shrubland alliance, if anyone is familiar with or having to do vegetation mapping work, rare plant mapping work, may have had to look into sort of these vegetation alliances and these categories that you find in the Sawyer's Menu of California Vegetation. And these are just it's ways of trying to, these ideas of alliances are just looking at patterns of species assemblages and trying to categorize them and figure out sort of statistically, systematically, how they interact ecologically and throughout the landscape and different dimensions of those. But this is one that is considered, it has a global rating of G3, state rating of S2. So it's a very rare or locally restricted shrubland alliance. And it's really only found on Montara Mountain within the park and a small section of Point Reyes. But it's a very diverse shrubland alliance or shrubland system. And really it sort of hits home this kind of gradient or kind of a blurring between these distinctions of maritime chaparral and coastal scrub, because you'll get just these very hyper diverse shrub communities, just very densely compacted together, where you'll get it with Holodiscus discolor, Mara fabaceus, several species of ribes, the gooseberries, several species of rubus, blackberry, thimbleberry, and so on, and also our huckleberry, Vaccinium ovatum, quite a bit of poison oak as well. And here are some examples of those common species that you're largely familiar with, but these are they're sort of co-dominant throughout this hazelnut scrubs, kind of shrub alliance. So there are a handful of species that are, I think, worth noting or discussing a bit that are found in the park. One of these is Durca occidentalis, western leatherwood. It is a rare and threatened plant, has a California rare plant ranking of 4.2. It's the lone North American representative of Thymeliaceae, large, family more distributed largely throughout Highland Asia is one area, but has these really interesting, typically the family, very fragrant flowers, but this, for many species, they often emerge prior to leaf emergence. So basically a late winter or midwinter bloomer, and just this pendant kind of cluster of flowers, very fragrant usually. And these Durca occidentalis is found in sort of this, typically associated with woodland understory, but also in maritime chaparral. If you go farther down the peninsula to, some of the more semi-xeric chaparral around Jasper Ridge Biological Station, you find Durca co-occurring with chamise and brittleleaf manzanita. So there's a bit of flexibility in sort of the niches that it can inhabit, but by and large, it's this very cool understory species, which they start blooming. There's some that are already blooming right now, and during warm years they'll start as early as November. And it's a beautiful species that when you see it in full bloom, like this bottom right here, everything else is maybe just starting to germinate or just starting to produce new growth. But it'll just form in a kind of thick population, just this really kind of gorgeous smattering of these yellow flowers. And an otherwise sort of sparse landscape. And there's some of the only plants that would be actually producing flowers that year, besides maybe a couple gooseberries, or if there are any of the diploid manzanitas nearby. But they also, as it was observed previously and was recently published as verification, is protogynous, which you can see in this top right photo. What that means is that basically the pistil, or the female structures of the flowers emerge prior to the staminate portions of the flower, the male flowers. And there's a number of different I guess strategically there are different reasons for this. It's thought to be a strategy that would minimize basically self-pollination, basically inbreeding, which can also be advantageous in cases too. It's just an interesting thing to consider, and there's a lot that is still yet to be known about this plant. So anyway, but it has this beautiful kind of banded, almost like umber white striped bark, as you can see in the bottom left photo here. And this species is endemic to the Bay Area, largely refined to the maritime influence of the fog belt. Some of the most extensive stands are throughout the Santa Cruz Mountains and basically the San Francisco Peninsula, but you also get it in the East Bay, again, where you still get a bit of the fog coming through basically these openings, or sort of low clearance in the coastal ranges, allowing that kind of the maritime influence state to really get in there. But also you'll find in the North Bay, as far north as just interior to Bodega Bay. But it's an interesting case too, as far as it is California endemic, but evolutionarily it's thought to have been evolved from the far more widespread Dirca palustris, the eastern leatherwood, which is thought this is a very old lineage, and prior to different interglacial periods and prior to the onset of basically the drying of much of the North American West and the onset of the Mediterranean climate in the past 7.5 million years, and a bit before then, eastern leatherwood was thought to be far more widespread, and they gradually retreated as conditions became drier into these sort of following, whether these hydrologic or different ecological niches where it was able to persist. Many of those obviously eventually became locally extirpated, locally extinct. But it's thought that Western leatherwood basically evolved by becoming so far removed from, it eventually became geographically isolated as it retreated into these optimal ecological corridors. And Eastern leatherwood occurs about as far, let's see, well, Arkansas, Tennessee, Georgia, about the western extent of that species. And there are some more recently described species associated in the Ozarks of Arkansas and a species in Mexico. But so there's a really interesting sort of biogeographic disjunction between sort of the historical legacy, at least as we understand it currently, of this whole lineage. Another interesting thing of where this group needs a bit of study, it's hypothesized that perhaps people who have studied this plant cannot observe basically reliable or ready pollinators. And that's very odd because they emerge during a time of year where there are few things in flower. And so you'd think that there would be a lot of competition, a lot of visitation from insects that are out right then. But sometimes if you find these growing next to a gooseberry that's blooming, tons of insects visiting gooseberry, nothing visiting this except maybe Apis mellifera, the European honeybee, and not even sticking around very long. And as far as dispersal goes, it's thought to be fruit limited to begin with. But it's, historically, it's thought to have this potential for widespread long distance dispersal, but now it's just very passive, dispersing not very far from the parent plant. So it's an interesting question that I hope we will learn more about in coming years. And there's a small population of this within the park along the Huckleberry Trail. This one is probably weeks away from it emerging. It's a, you know, kind of the highlight of it's sort of, I think for a lot of people, sort of marks the true beginning of California's wildflower season. This is Scoleopis bigelovii, a favorite of several common names being fetid adder's tongue. It's in the lily family, Liliaceae. And so the etymology is that scolios refers to crooked and pous or paus foot, and it's this crooked foot or otherwise slink pod, and that's in regard to you can see in the top right the fruit that is produced. So basically, the flowers as they emerge, they're erect, they're held upright, but as they're pollinated and ovaries begin to mature, as they develop towards fruit, they sort of arch over and start sort of is referred to sort of like it's slinking along the ground as the fruit continue to mature. And it creates, again, the adder's tongue is just sort of the persistent like a stigma lobes left on the fruit as it develops, sort of looking like the tongue of a serpent, so to speak. But these are interesting because they produce they're really mostly found in deep shade forest understory, or understory of chaparral or something where not very much light is able to penetrate and get through. And they bloom in basically peak phenology, at least around the Bay Area, and sort of the central north coast mountains, is December through March. So thing about phenology and climatic conditions, it's not really ideal, for attracting pollinators, and it's also still in the coldest window of the year. So what do you do about that if this is a way that you can sort of evade pressures of competition in these otherwise highly desirable environments? The flowers, well, very gorgeous. They have these kind of these striations, these purple and green striations, and those that are familiar with a lot of associations of flower coloration know that sort of this maroon coloration often lends off as kind of a rotten, often carrion dead animal, some kind of rotting smell. And so these flowers, if you get up close, take a whiff, they smell just like rotting flesh. And so the primary things that these are pollinated by are fungus gnats. While many insects are still dormant or not active this early in the season, fungus gnats are aplenty. These are, our mushroom season is currently in full swing with these rains. And so fungus gnats are in abundance. And so sure enough, they are very successful pollinators. And so they are able, this is a very successful species. And another interesting thing too is that when the seeds do mature, they bear lyosomes. And the lyosomes, for those not familiar, are basically these enzymatic portions, are sort of these protein-rich portions at the end of, or a portion of a seed that is typically associated with ant dispersal. Ants are drawn to sort of the nutrient enzyme-rich lyosome, but they'll carry the whole seed back underground. Carried in there, they'll eat the elizome and then leave the seed. So it's a very effective sort of mutualism between the plants and ants for dispersal. And these are all over the park, but in particular on the Huckleberry Trail. Personal bias, favorite trail of the park, but in a couple of months, you can't miss them. They're all over the place, and it's always a treat to see them. A couple early blooming but very charismatic species that you can find in the park. Two species: Trillium ovatum, and Trillium chloropetalum. So these, I kind of set up some differentiations for these two because where I'm used to seeing them, kind of right where the valley and the drainage along San Pedro Creek meets the eastern extent of the Huckleberry Trail, you get these clusters where you get both species growing side by side. And there's a little bit of confusion It's Trillium ovatum, supposedly not supposed to have modeling, but maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But anyway, these can easily be differentiated by one simple character. Are the flowers stalked or are they sessile? And so what you can see for Trillium ovatum on the left here, especially in the bottom photo from the side view, the flowers have these very pronounced stalks. And then to the right, Trillium chloropedalum, they're sessile, meaning they lack a stalk and they're really just coming right at the inflorescence emerges right at sort of the axis from the leaves. But some other differences are the modeling of the sort of the brown-green spots on chloropedalum. They also have these really beautiful purple anthers versus more, kind of typical yellow anthers in Trillium ovatum. Many Trillium species tend to fade towards sort of a pink or change color after pollination or associated with other cues, but it's pronounced in particular with Trillium ovatum. So just different things to consider if for anyone who has a tricky time differentiating between the two. And sort of one of the, as close to an endemic as we have in the park is Arctophoros montaraensis, the Montara mountain manzanita. It's in the Ericaceae, the blueberry family. And so it's really, mostly found on Montara Mountain and again in the maritime chaparral within the park on both the Montara Mountain Trail and Hazelnut Trail. But these are cool. They're part of what are called the auriculate clasping group of manzanitas that you really only find sort of a radiation of these many species. They're really mostly restricted to the Central Coast, just sort of the hotspot of manzanita radiation or diversification. But this is one of those, and there's 3 in the Santa Cruz Mountains that are kind of geographically and geologically segregated. So this is the farthest to the north, Montara manzanita, really thought to be associated with granites. But as you continue south to Kings Mountain, you get Arctophoros regis montana, Kings Mountain manzanita, very similar, but more long, kind of longer boat-shaped leaves, sagittate a bit, and in slightly different, more kind of woodland understory. And then to the south, especially along the Santa Cruz Sandhills, you get Arctophoros andersonii, Santa Cruz manzanita. Anyways, these 3 are superficially very similar, but this one is found predominantly within the park. And this is an obligate cedar, as I talked about in the beginning. It doesn't produce a basal burl. So during a fire, the entire plant burns and dies, but seed that it's been producing throughout the years has formed a persistent seed bank and has remained dormant. Once fire goes through, all of those will germinate, and that's how basically the cycles and new generations, different genotypes and different generations of the plant kind of have evolved strategies to deal with different kind of disturbance regimes. As mentioned, there is another manzanita that occurs in the park, and manzanita is a group that people often struggle with identifying. I won't go through it too much here, but major difference between the two. Brittle leaf manzanita, Arctophoros crustacea, has a pronounced basal burl, kind of this swollen meristematic area at the base of the stem. But also, as you can see in the bottom right photo here, this auriculate clasping refers to the leaf base, auriculate being sort of, say, kidney shaped or, almost like subchordate or almost heart shaped. And clasping meaning that it doesn't produce a petiole or sort of the, leaf stem. So it's really just attaching to the branchlet right there, or the branch. Whereas brittle leaf manzanita has a pronounced petiole, leaf stem. And another cool thing too is Arctophoros montaraensis has these imbricate leaves, which sort of means that the leaves, if looked at from the side, each leaf overlaps with the following one in the series. And it superficially is very similar to a San Bruno Mountain endemic Arctophoros imbricata, which is essentially Montara manzanitas gone prostrate. and this is upright and more arborescent or tree-like. And that is about it. And just to note, one other interesting early bloomer, Anemanoides grayi, or Gray's anemone, is found in a few small little clusters throughout the park. Again, another species that is far more predominant in to the north in the Pacific Northwest, but is established in the park. Anyway, yeah, thank you. And if I haven't gone too long, questions?
Hi, Morgan. Thank you. That was great. All right, so let's see what we have. Maybe I'll start at the bottom here. Okay. Ooh. All right. I was wondering about the same thing. When you were mentioning Huckleberry Trail, do you mean the hazelnut?
Oh my God. Sorry. Yes.
Yes? Okay.
Yes.
That's what I thought, but okay.
Whoops.
Barbara's asking the same. Okay. P. Stevens is asking, hi, I have a couple of questions. So how much fire danger does the park have? How likely to burn? And then we know from the Oakland Hills fires of 92 that eucalyptus dramatically increases fire risks. Why don't we remove them? And what is the project that's happening along the Weiler Ranch Trail near the east end of Hazelnut Trail, the cutting into the forest?
Okay.
So that's a threefold
Okay.
question.
First thing, I guess, speaking to fire, anywhere in California has some susceptibility to being burned, but maritime chaparral has historically has a lower fire interval, fire return interval. Again, it's just thinking about is, a lot of during sort of peak fire season and interior chaparral, what really is critical to these big sort of fire breakouts is just when there's very little to no soil water left and just standing vegetation is just parched. And that creates very flammable conditions. Maritime chaparral during the driest time of the year and when there would be sort of the highest propensity for fire, you have the summer fog layer, the maritime layer, which again, as kind of discussed during the maritime chaparral discussion, keeps soil moisture sort of abundant and readily available all throughout the year. And that could contribute quite a bit to minimizing fire or fire risk within chaparral there. It doesn't mean it's, it is a system that also has evolved within the context of fire, so it can burn, but it's not as readily susceptible to fire on the same scale as more interior chaparral.
And the removal of eucalyptus is always a controversial issue.
Yeah, let's see. What was the question regarding eucalyptus?
Well,
again?
the fact that, in Oakland Hills, the fires of 92, that was a disaster.
Yes.
And so since the eucalyptus increases fire risks, why don't we just simply have them removed in the park?
Right. People love eucalyptus. It's
Yeah.
Some do, some, it's strong opinions on both sides of it. And there's also management
issues.
As far as monarch habitat when you're in close proximity to the coast. I'm sure there's plenty of other things that are off my radar that are considered as obstructions in moving forward in large scale eucalyptus removal.
I think the county also has to, even if they cut and then you have to spray, the question of spraying with some chemicals is always a big issue in the county parks.
Yes.
So that's another thing, that even if you do cut, you can have resprouting.
Yep.
And so you have to spray, but the spraying, visitation is there, people coming through, so there's There's always an argument that it's not safe to do so.
Yes.
So, and what project is happening along the Weiler Ranch Trail?
You could speak to that better than I can.
I think they're doing something about bridges or something, or there's something going on, I know, but I can't quite recall what it was that I was told about that. I'm sorry, I can't quite remember. I know that they're working on something, but I'm not, I'm going to just invent something. So best thing is to go to the visitor center and ask some of the rangers who are there. That would be your best bet, because I may just invent something and I'd rather not.
I did see there was right above that, there was a question from Chloe that I was hoping someone would ask, but where she asked eucalyptus are also allelopathic. Nope. And this is kind of I don't know. There was a study that was started maybe 7 years ago by I'm forgetting who was involved. It was several scientists at Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, they decided, it's like growing up, even if you weren't that immersed in nature, I feel like if you grew up in California, what's one of the first things you learn about plants, or maybe learn about eucalyptus? And there's often this sort of anecdotal thing of this idea of eucalyptus being allelopathic. And allelopathy, for anyone not as familiar, is this idea of plants, either producing or contributing chemicals to the soil that would inhibit the growth of other plants nearby, ideally to minimize competition, sort of interspecies competition, and sort of maximize the localized fecundity or success. And so what they did was I'll be quick with this, but they did a big literature review and realized very few studies, if any, actually ever investigated allelopathy as far in pertaining to eucalyptus. It was always this sort of assumption, and even presented in the scientific literature going back decades and decades. And so they decided to basically do a study looking at whether or not eucalyptus is actually allelopathic, and how, and with this idea of allelopathy, comparing it to other dominant trees, and other sort of co-occurring dominants throughout the landscape. And what they found was directly, no. They actually, as far as chemical production or exudates going directly into the soil, they're far less allelopathic than, say, coast live oak, valley oak, Aesculus, buckeye,
Really?
number of different native species that produce, that to varying degrees contribute chemicals to the soil that would inhibit other growth. However, so it's sort of their findings, and I'm not, if anyone knows of follow-ups that either challenge this or have updates on this data, but essentially the idea was like, no, they're not allelopathic, but again, this low light entry or low light availability due to the canopy, and also litter accumulation, in conjunction with the oils produced, that those three factors would dramatically inhibit the growth.
The litter collection from these trees is just absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah. So, but anyway,
yeah.
I like that study because anyway.
So it proves that they aren't.
Well,
I mean,
but at least it's sort
they're
of
on a lower scale than other trees.
Yeah, or it emphasizes even within science the prevalence of assumption-based
Assumptions, yes, exactly.
Yes.
Well put. Bob Case, are we talking about native species in regards to what precisely? Which native species?
Maybe the talk is about native species.
Maybe I can. Bob, you want to clarify that question? Let's see.
While that's being, I'm just scrolling through the question thing right here. One question from Carlos Davidson was the main grasslands on the valley flat, heading east-west, not native? The answer is predominantly they are non-native. Mostly European annual grasses, lots of bromus, lots of brisa, which is the rattlesnake grass, avena, various other oats. You can occasionally find a little bit of like Stipa pulchra, purple needlegrass, but it's not the expanses and not many of the actual perennial bunch grasses like Danthonia that are more characteristic of the historic grasslands that were in the park.
And
And
then how invasive are plants or how are invasive plants impacting diversity in the park? Are they as such or not yet?
Someone who works in the park or is involved in management or active monitoring could answer that better, but I feel as at least from just observing changes in the park from my time there over the past 6 years, some species that jump out of note is in pampas grass, Cordaderia jubata. We're seeing quite a bit more of it recently, and also getting established in some of the drainages. So it's, when you see it along like in the around Valley View or these areas that have this higher turnover, just higher instance of recent anthropogenic human-based disturbance, it's not as surprising. It's still problematic though, because it's, the seeds are wind dispersed and once there's a source, it's almost impossible to get rid of it if it is able to get established within sort of these, whether you want to call them wildland corridors or intact habitat. And so this was the first, maybe I just didn't see it before, but in the past year is the first time I've started seeing it within some of the drainages when in conjunction up in the maritime chaparral. So that's one that is always alarming to see. Genista French broom is always an issue, but you don't see it as much again once you get onto the granites or up into the higher elevation chaparral. Delaria odorata, the Cape ivy, is pretty bad along the open riparian corridors. There are likely others that again are off my radar, but that someone who is more directly involved in management work in the park could answer.
Well, what we need, unfortunately, the Friends and the county need help, volunteers who are going to pull or dig out the pampas grass or pull the Cape ivy. And then of course in all of these cases, the pampas grass is so huge and so deep that you have to resort to chemical control. And we're running up against that problem with the county, that they're not really ready to spray. And yet, yes, the pampas grass, especially I've been seeing over the years, has been increasing at an alarming rate. They handled some of the ivy, but that comes back with alarming speed too, especially in the riparian corridor.
Yes.
So, but volunteers, man hours who are going to just literally people who are going to come in and spend time when there are work parties. This is something that we seriously need help with. The Friends do, and as a consequence, we would help the county with these issues as well. Because if they're not going to use pesticides or any type of herbicides or anything, then it's manual labor or getting rid of plumes at least.
Yes.
Something. Yeah, it's a catch-22 there.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, I better go the other way.
I see a couple quick ones. Paul Jones asked, have Trillium albetum and albetum and chloropetalum been combined? spacing right now. I'll get back to you on that one, but
So you answered the question about the grasslands?
no,
Heading
no,
east-west?
I jumped to a different question, but then I was just trying to remember the more recent work that was done on Trillium. Get back to that one. Grasslands.
So is the main grasslands on the Valley Flat heading east-west?
Oh,
Not
yes.
native?
Yeah.
They are not native. No.
Um,
And then they cut them late.
yeah.
The mowing of the meadows takes place quite late. So unfortunately, the grasses reach the point where they're already going to seed, and that just multiplies everything many times over.
Yeah, it's probably the former artichoke fields.
Yeah, probably.
Charlotte asked, are there any active restoration projects in the park right now focused on protecting habitat for the rare plant populations? I personally don't know, but so that may also be something that you, Mila, or others involved with the park could answer. I know that there's been work trying to, at least with the remaining Durka, trying to make sure it doesn't get overtopped or shaded out by surrounding plants, but yeah, I'm not sure about the others.
There's just not enough help. I mean, in terms of getting, we have restoration projects on the first Saturday from 9 to 12, every Saturday of each month. There's habitat restoration that takes place, I believe, either this
Second.
second or third Saturday. There's
Yeah.
trail restoration on the first 3 Saturdays of the month.
Yeah, two Saturdays.
There's 2 Saturdays. There's always something going on, and it's always a very small group of people, the same ones who volunteer consistently month after month after month. And if you can spare the time, if you can come and help, or if you know of anyone who can come and help, that would be very helpful.
So trail looks like the second.
Yeah,
Habitat restoration.
the trail days are on the second Saturday, and habitat restoration is actually on the third. Yeah, second and third. So habitat restoration third Saturday of each month, trail day restoration second Saturday. There's always lots of work to be done. So yeah.
I saw Stephen Finney asked the question. I thought you described maritime chaparral as low elevation, but the Montara manzanita is often at 1,800 feet or so. Is that low? And it's a good question. Want to note that basically the figure that I showed comparing maritime, transition, and interior chaparral encompassed multiple sites. So it's, kind of the error bars within each of those describe the range. But yes, relatively speaking, sure, 1,800 feet, especially for Montara manzanita, and the Montara Mountain Associated Maritime Chaparral would be high for there, but where it really picks up is lower. But what that's speaking to is also low elevation relative to these other interior, less maritime influenced chaparral conditions. It's, you can get, for instance, even in parts of the Santa Lucias, you can get areas that are considered at least loosely maritime chaparral influenced at pretty high elevations, but it's really just it's what's critical is that it's receiving that summer fog inundation, and so that's really what's driving the character. And elevation again is it's really relatively speaking, but it's definitely below, say, the 3,000 to 4,000 feet or 2,000 to 4,000 feet typically of more interior chaparral. And then Bing Huey asked if do you think coastal scrub areas of low density can also contain significant amounts of grassland, which is a great question. And yes, definitely. And recently, if for anyone who's had experience doing kind of, I guess, vegetation mapping work, especially in the North Coast, especially Sonoma, Mendocino County, where there's a lot of development along coastal areas. The kind of the definition of coastal prairie was sort of redefined recently to encompass a certain to basically account for high presence or high cover of sort of either non-native annual grasses or coastal scrub or even Douglas fir encroachment, just because of the fact that coastal prairie as a system has most of the species, there's a very persistent seed bank. And there is this kind of back and forth evolution, sort of historically and evolutionarily. And so having that persistent seed bank means that if you get a fire coming through that cuts everything back, it can return once again, or a lot of the propagules are there to where you'll find the species ready to emerge again. And so the argument is that that should still be considered grassland, coastal grassland, or coastal prairie. Anyway, I don't know if that's clearly answers your question, but my argument would be yes, any areas that were formerly considered as coastal grassland still absolutely, even if the cover is dramatically different now, still is at least potentially
Potential for reverting back after a fire.
yes.
Hmm.
When and there's plenty of dynamics within that to consider too, with also non-natives and whatnot. But yes, very likely propagules are there for it to once again sort of revert to a coastal grassland type system.
Well, the Devil's Slide question that's here, Pride of Madeira, I think, yeah. But that's on the Devil's Slide Trail, which is outside the park.
But yes,
Yes,
concerned.
yes. One should be concerned. It's quite, it sort of takes over that one.
Yep.
Uh,
Julie Walters asked, where in the park can you see fritillary? And I would say again on the Hazelnut Trail, again, as you enter from the visitor center in that open grassland area in the beginning, the first quarter mile or half mile of the trail, you'll see plenty of it growing right there.
yeah, the hazelnut has lots of interesting things. First thing early in late winter, early spring. The hazelnut trail there is just absolutely phenomenal.
Yep. Okay.
So something about carefully painted with herbicide, just a ring. Well, yes, you have to convince the rangers, Barbara. I believe they said it was about flood control during the rains. What was Morgan?
Oh,
Can you make sense of this? I believe they said it was about flood control during the rains. Ah, probably the construction.
gotcha.
I think, is that right, Bing? Is that what you're mentioning here? Is that what the work is that's being done on Weiler Ranch? About flood control during the rains? Probably. Yeah, it makes sense. So the fritillary, removal of large invasive species, what methods? Yeah, well, there's only two methods. Manual labor and then spraying.
Pampas is not fun to remove at all under any.
No, I know, I've worked on it myself. I hate the stuff, like, yeah, right. Or you remove just the plumes, and that's not enough. You have to remove the plant.
Yep. I saw Barbara Cussy asked, Morgan, do you work with county parks to help them prioritize managing the plant resources? Again, I am not employed or work directly with San Pedro Valley Park, so I can't speak to there. For work I do for soil ecology, occasionally we'll get contracts with county or state parks. And in those cases, yes, but I don't work directly with San Pedro Valley Park. Another question was, what are we missing out on because of oxalis? And while there is oxalis piscapri in the park, I have yet to notice it in any of the areas where there's sort of intact habitat, get patches along some of the disturbed, if you want to call it coastal scrub at that point, or just disturbed mishmash, but probably not too much, because it really, where Oxalis pescapri is able to get established along the coast are really these sort of early successional disturbed environments. Granted, in certain cases, I'm sure they can impact species on a case-by-case scenario, but as far as the park goes, I would feel confident saying probably not missing out on much.
Right. So Bing has clarified. He says, yes, that the work at the back of Weiler Ranch has to do with this water drainage issue. So thank you, Bing, for clarifying that. And if we can't use goats because there's so many native plants that they eat everything under the sun. So I don't think anyone has actually thought of bringing goats in. I don't think you could really, I don't know.
It would be a difficult system to use goats. Just
Yes, yeah.
Humanity.
I don't know whether that would really be that easily. You control what the goats eat. This one, that one. Yes. Well, I don't know. It's never even come up as a suggestion. So, and I don't know how easily it would be accomplished. But I think it's about time to thank Morgan, and he's really been with us for a long time, and I think he needs a break. But we must thank him for a remarkable lecture and for taking all the time to answer all the questions and responding to the comments and so on and so forth. So thank you, Morgan, for a very erudite lecture on the various floristic ecosystems that we have in the park, and what's where and why and so on and so forth. So you've certainly delved into the issue quite well, to say the least.
No, thanks for having me, and thanks for attending.
Right. So we've had a very good attendance today, and so thank you for agreeing to do this. You're always a godsend in terms of botany. God help me. Yes, you are. Anyway, take care, and thank you all for joining us. And we're sorry we can't applaud you, Morgan, but we're all thanking you very, very much from the bottom of our hearts for a really great lecture. Thank you.
Hey, thank you.
Good night.
Night.
And I'm ending this webinar. So cheerio, everyone.